Sometimes he was uncertain which name.
The first sparks fall. Elida do Avrini Aroyhan absently fingered the long seven-striped stole about her shoulders, the stole of the Amerlin seat, as she sat behind her wide writing table. Many would have accounted her beautiful at first glance, but a second look made it clear that the severity of her ageless Aes Sedai face was not a momentary matter. Today there was something more, a light of anger in her dark eyes, if anyone had noticed. She barely listened to the women arrayed on stools before her. Their dresses were every color from white to the darkest red, in silk or wool as each woman's taste dictated, yet all but one wore their formal shawls, embroidered white flame of tar valens centered on their backs, colored fringe proclaiming their ajas, as though this were a meeting of the hall of the tower. They discussed reports and rumors of events in the world, trying to sift fact from fancy, trying to decide the tower's course of action, but they seldom even glanced at the woman behind the table, the woman they had sworn to obey. Elida could not keep her full attention on them. They did not know what was really important, or rather they knew, and feared to speak of it. There is apparently something happening in Shinar. That was Danelle, slight and often seemingly lost in a dream, the only brown sister present. Green and Yellow also had only one sister apiece, and none of the three Ajas was pleased about that. There were no blues. Now Danelle's big blue eyes looked thoughtfully inward. An unnoticed ink smudge stained her cheek, and her dark gray wool dress was rumpled.
Just give me one
There are
second,
rumors
everyone.
of skirmishes, not with Trollocs, and not Aiel, though raids through the Niam passes appear to have increased. Between Shinarans, unusual for the borderlands, they seldom fight each other. If they intend to have a civil war, they have chosen the proper time for it, Alviarin said coolly. Tall and slim and all in white silk, she was the one without a shawl. The stole of the keeper around her shoulders was white also, to show she had been raised from the white Aja. Not red, Elida's former Aja, as tradition held. Whites were always cool. The Trollocs might as well have vanished. The entire blight seems quiet enough for 2 farmers and a novice to guard. Teslin's bony fingers shuffled papers on her lap, though she did not look at them. One of 4 red sisters there, more than any other Aja, she ran Elida a close second for severity, though no one had ever thought her beautiful. Better, perhaps, if it did no be so quiet, Teslin said, her Ilianer accent strong. I did receive a message this morning that the Marshal General of Saldaia does have an army on the move. No toward the Blight, but in the opposite direction, south and east. He would no ever have done that if the Blight did no seem to be asleep. Then word of Mazrim Taim is seeping out. Alviarin could have been discussing the weather or the price of carpets, instead of a potential disaster. Much effort had gone into capturing Taim, and as much into hiding his escape. No good to the tower if the world learned they could not hold on to a false dragon once he was taken. And it seems that Queen Tenobia or Davram Bashir, or both, thinks we cannot be trusted to deal with him again. Dead quiet fell at the mention of Taim. The man could channel. He had been on his way to Tar Valon to be gentled, cut off from the one power forever, when he was broken free. Yet that was not what curbed tongues. Once the existence of a man able to channel the one power had been the deepest anathema. Hunting such men down was the main reason of existence for the Red, and every Aja helped as it could. But now most of the women beyond the table shifted on their stools, refusing to meet each other's eyes, because speaking of Taim brought them too close to another subject they did not want to speak aloud. Even Elida felt bile rise in her stomach. Apparently Alviarin experienced no such reluctance. One corner of her mouth quirked momentarily in what might have been smile or grimace. I will redouble our efforts to retake Taim. and I suggest that a sister be dispatched to counsel Tenobia, someone used to overcoming the sort of stubborn resistance that young woman will put up. Others rushed to help fill the silence. Jolene shifted her green-fringed shawl on slender shoulders and smiled, though it seemed a bit forced. Yes, she needs an Aes Sedai at her shoulder, someone able to handle Bashir. He has excessive influence with Tenobia. He must move his army back where it can be used if the Blight wakes up. Too much bosom showed in the gap of her shawl, and her pale green silk was too snug, too clinging, and she smiled too much for Elida's liking, especially at men. Greens always did. The last thing we need now is another army on the march, Shemarin, the Yellow Sister, said quickly. A slightly plump woman, she had somehow never really managed the outward calm of Aes Sedai. There was often a strain of anxiety around her eyes, and more so of late. And someone to Shinar, added Javindra, another red. Despite smooth cheeks, her angular face was hard enough to hammer nails. Her voice was harsh. I don't like trouble of this sort in the borderlands. The last thing we need is Shinar weakening itself to the point where a Trolloc army could break through. Perhaps, Alviarin nodded, considering. But there are agents in Shinar, Red, I am sure, and perhaps others? The four Red sisters nodded tightly, reluctantly. No one else did. Who can warn us if these small clashes become anything to worry us? It was an open secret that every Aja except the White, devoted to logic and philosophy as it was, had watchers and listeners scattered through the nations to varying degrees, though the Yellow Network was believed to be a pitiful thing. There was nothing of sickness or healing they could learn from those who could not channel. Some individual sisters had their own eyes and ears, though perhaps even more closely guarded than agents of the Ajas. The Blues had had the most extensive, both Aja and personal. As for Tenobia and Davram Bashir, Alviarin went on, are we agreed that they must be dealt with by sisters? She hardly waited for heads to nod. Good. It is done. Memara will do nicely. She will take no nonsense from Tenobia, while never letting her see the leash. Now, does anyone have fresh word out of Arad Doman or Tarabon? If we do not do something there soon, we may find that Padron Niall and the White Cloaks have sway from Bandar Eben to the Shadow Coast. Ivanaline, you have something? Arad Doman and Tarabon were racked by civil wars and worse. There was no order anywhere. Elida was surprised they would bring it up. Only a rumor, the Grey Sister replied. Her silk dress, matching the fringe on her shawl, was finely cut and scooped low at the neck. Often Elida thought the woman should have been green, so concerned was she with her looks and clothes. Almost everyone in those poor lands is a refugee, including those who might send news. The Panarch Amathera has apparently vanished, and it seems an Aes Sedai may have been involved. Elida's hand tightened on her stole. Nothing touched her face, but her eyes smoldered. The matter of the Saldaean army was done. At least Memara was red. That was a surprise, but they had not even asked her opinion. It was done. The startling possibility that an Aes Sedai was involved in the disappearance of the Panarch, if this was not another of the 1,000 improbable tales that drifted from the western coast, could not take Elida's mind from that. There were Aes Sedai scattered from the Arith Ocean to the spine of the world, and the Blues, at least, might do anything. Less than 2 months since they had all knelt to swear fealty to her as the embodiment of the White Tower, and now the decision was made without so much as a glance in her direction. The Amerlin study sat only a few levels up in the White Tower, yet this room was the heart of the tower, as surely as the tower itself, the color of bleached bone, was the heart of the great island city of Tar Valon, cradled in the river Aranin. And Tar Valon was, or should be, the heart of the world. The room spoke of the power wielded by the long line of women who had occupied it, floor of polished redstone from the mountains of mist, tall fireplace of golden Kandori marble, walls paneled in pale, oddly striped wood, marvelously carved with unknown birds and beasts more than 1,000 years ago. Stone like glittering pearls framed the tall, arched windows that led onto the balcony overlooking the Amerlin's private garden, the only stone like it known, salvaged from a nameless city swallowed by the sea of storms during the breaking of the world. A room of power, a reflection of Amerlins who had made thrones dance to their calling for nearly 3,000 years, and they did not even ask her opinion. It happened too often, this slighting. Worst, most bitter of all, perhaps, they usurped her authority without even thinking of it. They knew how she had come to the stole, knew their aid had put it on her shoulders. She herself had been too much aware of that, but they presumed too far. It would soon be time to do something about that, but not quite yet.
Let me load my dabber up.
She had put her own stamp on the room, as much as possible,
so
with a writing table ornately carved in triple-linked rings and a heavy chair that raised an inlaid ivory flame of tarvalin above her dark hair, like a large, snowy teardrop. 3 boxes of altar and lacquerwork were arranged on the table, precisely equidistant from each other. One held the finest of her collection of carved miniatures. A white vase on a simple plinth against one wall held red roses that filled the room with sweet fragrance. There had been no rain since she was raised, but fine blossoms were always available with the power. She'd always liked flowers. They could be so easily pruned and trained to produce beauty. 2 paintings hung, where seated she could see them merely by lifting her head. The others avoided looking at them. Among all the Aes Sedai who came to Elida's study, only Alviarin ever so much as glanced at them. "Is there any news of Elaine?" Andaya asked diffidently. A thin, bird-like little woman, outwardly timid despite Aes Sedai features, the second Grey looked an unlikely mediator, but was in fact one of the best. There were still faint traces of tension in her voice. "Or Galad? If Morghese discovers that we have lost her stepson, she may begin to ask more questions concerning the whereabouts of her daughter, yes? And if she learns we have lost the daughter heir, Andor may become as close to us as Amadisia." A few women shook their heads. There was no news, and Javindra said, "A Red Sister is in place in the royal palace, newly raised, so she can easily pass for other than Aes Sedai." She meant that the woman had not yet taken on the agelessness that came with long use of the power. Someone trying to guess the age of any woman in the study would have fumbled over a range of 20 years, and in some cases would be off by twice that. She is well trained, though, quite strong and a good observer. Morghese is absorbed in putting forward her claim to the Kyrianan throne. Several women shifted on their stools, and as if realizing she had stepped close to dangerous ground, Javindra hurried on. "And her new lover, Lord Gabriel, seems to be keeping her occupied otherwise." Her thin mouth narrowed even further. "She's completely besotted with the man." "He keeps her concentrated on Kyrian," Alviarin said. "The situation there is nearly as bad as in Tarabon and Arad Doman, with every house contending for the Sun Throne, and famine everywhere. Morghese will re-establish order, but it will take time for her to have the throne secure. Until that is done, she will have little energy left to worry about other matters, even the daughter heir. And I set a clerk the task of sending occasional letters. The woman does a good imitation of Elaine's hand. Morghese will keep until we can secure proper control of her again." "At least we still have her son in hand," Jolene smiled. "Gawain do hardly be in hand," Teslin said sharply. "Those younglings of his do skirmish with the White Cloaks on both sides of the river. He does act on his own as much as at our direction." "He will be brought under control," Alviarin said. Elida was beginning to find that constant cool composure hateful. "Speaking of the White Cloaks," Danelle put in, "it seems that Pedro Niall is conducting secret negotiations, trying to convince Altara and Morandi to cede land to Ilian, and thus keep the Council of Nine from invading one or both." Safely back from the precipice, the women on the other side of the table nattered on, deciding whether the Lord Captain Commander's negotiations might gain too much influence for the Children of the Light. Perhaps they should be disrupted, so the tower could step in and replace him. Elida's mouth twisted. The tower had often in its history been cautious of necessity. Too many feared them, too many distrusted them, but it had never feared anything or anyone. Now it feared. She raised her eyes to the paintings. One consisted of 3 wooden panels depicting Bonwin, the last red to have been raised to the Amerlin seat 1,000 years before, and the reason no red had worn the stole since. Until Elida. Bonwin, tall and proud, ordering Aes Sedai in their manipulations of Arthur Hawkwing. Bonwin, defiant on the white walls of Tar Valon, under siege by Hawkwing's forces. And Bonwin, kneeling and humbled before the hall of the tower as they stripped her of stole and staff for nearly destroying the tower. Many wondered why Elida had had the triptych retrieved from the storerooms, where it had lain covered in dust. If none spoke openly, she had still heard the whispers. They did not understand that constant reminder of the price of failure was necessary. The second painting was in the new fashion, on stretched canvas, a copy of a street artist's sketch from the distant west. That one caused even more unease among the Aes Sedai who saw it. 2 men fought among clouds, seemingly in the sky, wielding lightning for weapons. One had a face of fire. The other was tall and young with reddish hair.
Hey, John
It was the
McDonald,
youth
how you
who caused
doing?
the fear.
You know what?
Made
Let's
even
do a
Elida's teeth
let's do a
clench.
dab while you're
She was
here.
not sure if it was
That's
in
some
anger or to keep them from chattering. But
lemon
fear
pound
could and
cake
must
crumble.
be controlled. Control was all. "We are done, then," Alviarin said, rising smoothly from her shawl. The others copied her, adjusting skirts and shawls in preparation for leaving. "In 3 days I will expect— Have I given you leave to go, daughters?" Those were the first words Elida had spoken since telling them to be seated. They looked at her in surprise. Surprise! Some moved back toward the stools, not with any haste, and not a word of apology. She had let this go on much too long. "Since you are standing, you will remain so until I am done."
Hell yeah.
A moment of confusion caught
Oh,
those
no
half
problem,
seated,
John
and she
McDonald.
continued as they straightened again uncertainly. "I have heard no mention of the search for that woman and her companions." No need to name that woman, Elida's predecessor. They knew who she meant, and Elida found it harder every day even to think the former Amerlin's name. All of her current problems, all, could be
But it's
laid at
definitely
that
pretty
woman's
good. It has a
feet.
nice lemony
"It is
scent to it,
difficult," Alviarin said evenly,
flavor too.
"since we have bolstered the rumors that she was executed." The woman had ice for blood. Elida met her eyes firmly until she added a belated "Mother," but it was too placid, even casual. Elida swung her gaze to the others, made her voice steel. "Jolene, you have charge of that search and of the investigation of her escape. In both cases I hear of nothing but difficulties. Perhaps a daily penance will help you increase your diligence, daughter. Write out what you think suitable and submit it to me. Should I find it less than suitable, I will triple it." Jolene's ever-present smile faded in satisfactory fashion. She opened her mouth, then closed it again under Elida's steady stare. Finally, she curtsied deeply. "As you command, Mother." The words were tight, the meekness forced, but it would do, for now. "And what of trying to bring back those who fled?" If anything, Elida's tone was even harder. The return of the Aes Sedai who had run away when that woman was deposed meant the return of blues to the tower. She was not sure she could ever trust any blue, but then she was not sure she could ever bring herself to trust any who had fled instead of hailing her ascension. Yet the tower must be whole again. Javindra was overseeing that task. Again, there are difficulties. Her features remained as severe as ever, but she licked her lips quickly at the storm that swept silently across Elida's face. Mother. Elida shook her head. I will not hear of difficulties, daughter. Tomorrow you will place before me a list of everything you have done, including all measures taken to see the world does not learn of any new dissension in the tower. That was deadly important. There was a new Amerlin, but the world must see the tower as united and strong as ever. If you do not have enough time for the work I give you, perhaps you should give up your place as sitter for the Red in the hall. I must consider it. That will not be necessary, the hard-faced woman said. You will have the report you require tomorrow. I am sure many will start returning soon. Elida was not so certain, however much she wanted it. The tower must be strong. It must. But her point was made. Troubled thoughtfulness marked every eye but Alviarin's. If Elida was ready to come down on one of her own former Aja, and even harder on a Green who had been with her from the first day, perhaps they had made a mistake in treating her as a ceremonial effigy. Perhaps they had put her on the Amerlin seat, but now she was the Amerlin. A few more examples in the coming days should drive it home. If necessary, she would have every woman here doing penance till they begged mercy. There are Tyrant soldiers in Kyrian as well as Andoran, she went on, ignoring a vertigo. Tyrant soldiers sent by the man who took the Stone of Tyr. Shemarin clasped her hands tight and tested her. Only Alviarin remained unruffled as a frozen pond. Elida flung out her hand and pointed to the painting of two men fighting with lightning. Look at it. Look! Or I will have every last one of you on hands and knees scrubbing floors. If you have not the backbone even to look at a painting, what courage can you have for what is to come? Cowards are no use to the tower. Slowly they raised their eyes, shuffling feet like nervous girls instead of Aes Sedai. Only Alviarin merely looked, and only she appeared untouched. Shimmering wrung her hands, and tears actually welled in her eyes. Something would have to be done with Shimmering. A man who can channel. The words left Elida's mouth like a whip. They made her own stomach knot up till she feared she might vomit. Somehow she kept her face smooth and pressed on, pushed the words out. Stones from a sling. He was fated to go mad and wreak horror with the world before he dies. But more than that, Aradoman and Taraban and everything between is a ruin of rebellion because of him. If the war and famine in Kyrian cannot be tied to him of a certainty, he surely precipitates a greater war there between Tyr and Andor when the tower needs peace. In Gildan, some mad preaches of him to crowds too great for the Commander's army to contain. The greatest danger the tower has ever faced. The greatest threat the world has ever faced, and you cannot make yourselves speak of him? You cannot gaze at his image? Silence answered her. All save Alviarin looked as though their tongues were frozen. Most stared at the young man in the painting, birds hypnotized by a snake. Randall Thor. The name tasted bitter on Elida's lips. Once she had had that young man, so innocent in appearance, within arm's reach, and she had not seen what he was. Her predecessor had known for the light alone knew how long, and had left him to run wild. That woman had told her a great deal before escaping, had said things when put hard to the question that Elida would not let herself believe. If the Forsaken were truly free, all might be lost. But somehow she had managed to refuse some answers, and then before she could be put to the question, that woman, and her name. That woman in the blue had known all along. Elida intended to have them both back in the tower. They would tell every last scrap of what they knew. They would plead on their knees for death before she was done. She forced herself to go on, though the words curdled in her mouth. Randall Thor is the dragon reborn, daughters. Shimmeren's knees gave way, and she sat down hard on the floor. Some of the others appeared to have weak knees as well. Elida's eyes flogged them with scorn. There can be no doubt of it. He is the one spoken of in the prophecies. The Dark One is breaking free of his prison. The last battle is coming. and the Dragon Reborn must be there to face him, or the world is doomed to fire and destruction so long as the wheel of time turns. And then free, daughters. We do not know where he is. We know a dozen places he is in. He is no longer in Tyr. He is not here in the tower, safely shielded as he should be. He brings the whirlwind down on the world, and we must stop it if there is to be any hope of surviving Tarmangaiden. We must have him in hand to see he fights in the last battle. Or do any of you believe he will go willingly to his prophesied death to save the world? A man who must be going mad already? We must have him in control. Mother, Alviarin began with that irritating lack of emotion, but Elida stopped her with a glare. Putting our hands on Randall Thor is more important by far than skirmishes in Shinar, or whether the Blight is quiet. More important than finding Elaine or Galad. More important even than Mazrim Taim. You will find him. You will. When next I see you, each of you will be ready to tell me in detail what you have done to make it so. Now you may leave me, daughters. A ripple of unsteady curtsies, breathy murmurs of, "As you command, mother," and they came close to running, Jolene helping Shemarin wobbling to her feet. The yellow sister would do nicely for the next example. Some would be necessary to make sure none of them slid back, and she was too weak to be allowed in this council. Of course, this council would not be allowed to continue any longer in any case. The hall would hear her words and leave. All three Alviarin went. For a long moment after the door had closed behind the others, the two women met each other's eyes. Alviarin had been the first, the very first, to hear and agree with the charges against Elida's predecessor, and Alviarin knew full well why she wore the Keeper's stole instead of someone from the Red. The Red Aja had favored Elida unanimously, but the White had not done so, and without wholehearted support from the White, many others might not have come round, in which case Elida would have been in a cell instead of sitting on the Amerlin seat. That is, if the remains of her head were not decorating a spike for the ravens to play with. Alviarin would not be so easily intimidated as the others, if she could be intimidated at all. There was a disturbing feel of equal to equal in Alviarin's unwavering gaze. A tap at the door sounded loud in the quiet. "Come," Elida snapped. One of the accepted, a pale, slender girl, stepped hesitantly into the room and immediately dropped a curtsy so low her white skirt with its 7 bands of color at the hem made a wide pool around her on the floor. From the wideness of her blue eyes and the way she kept them on the floor, she had caught the mood of the women leaving. Where Aes Sedai left shaking, an accepted went at great peril. "Mother, Master Fane is here. He said you would see him at this hour." The girl swayed in her crouch, on the point of falling over from stark fear. "Then send him in, girl, instead of keeping him waiting," Elida growled. But she would have had the girls hide if she had not kept the man outside. The anger she held back from Alviarin, she would not let herself think that she did not dare show it. That anger welled up. "And if you cannot learn to speak properly, perhaps the kitchens are a better place for you than the Amerlin's anteroom. Well, are you going to do as you were told? Move, girl, and tell the Mistress of Novices you need to be taught to obey with alacrity." The girl squeaked something that might have been a correct response and darted out. With an effort, Elida got hold of herself. It did not concern her whether Sylviana, the new Mistress of Novices, beat the girl to incoherence or let her off with a lecture. She barely saw novices or accepted unless they intruded on her, and cared less. It was Alviarin she wanted humbled and on her knees. But Fane now. She tapped one finger against her lips. A bony little man with a big nose, who had appeared at the tower only days earlier in dirty, once fine clothes too big for him, arrogant and cringing by turns, seeking audience with the Amerlin. Except for those who served the tower, men came there only under duress or in great need, and none asked to speak to the Amerlin. A fool in some ways, or conceivably a half-wit, He claimed to be from Lugard in Morandi, but spoke in various accents, sometimes slipping from one to another in mid-sentence. Yet it seemed he might be useful. Alviarin was still looking at her, so icily complacent, just a hint in her eyes of the questions she must have about Fane. Elida's face hardened. Almost she reached for Saidar, the female half of the true source, to teach the woman her place with the power. But that was not the way. Alviarin might even resist, and fighting like a farm girl in a stable yard was no method for the Amerlin to make her authority plain. Yet Alviarin would learn to yield to her as surely as the others would. The first step would be leaving Alviarin in the dark concerning Master Fane, or whatever his real name was.
Padan Fane put the frantic young accepted out of his mind as he stepped into the Amerlin's study. She was a toothsome bit, and he liked them fluttering like birds in the hand, but there were more important matters to concentrate on now. Dry washing his hands, he ducked his head suitably low, suitably humbly, but the two awaiting him seemed unaware of his presence at first, locked eye to eye as they were. It was all he could do not to stretch out a hand to caress the tension between them. Tension and division wove everywhere through the White Tower. All to the good. Tension could be tweaked, division exploited, as need be. He had been surprised to find Elida on the Amerlin seat. Better than what he had expected, though. In many ways she was not so tough, he had heard, as the woman who had worn the stole before her. Harder, yes, and more cruel, but more brittle, too. More difficult to bend, likely, but easier to break. If either became necessary. Still, one Aes Sedai, one Amerlin even, was much like another to him. Fools. Dangerous fools, true, but useful dupes at times. Finally, they realized he was there, the Amerlin frowning slightly at being taken by surprise, the keeper of the chronicles unchanging. "You may go now, daughter," Elida said firmly, a slight but definite emphasis on now. Oh, yes, the tensions, the cracks in power. Cracks where seeds could be planted. Fane caught himself on the point of giggling. Alviarin hesitated before giving the briefest of curtsies. As she swept out of the room, her eyes brushed across him, expressionless, yet disconcerting. Unconsciously he huddled, hunching his shoulders protectively. His upper lip fluttered in a half-snarl at her slim back. On occasion he had the feeling, just for an instant, that she knew too much about him, but he could not have said why. Her cool face, cool eyes, they never changed. At those times he wanted to make them change. Fear, agony, pleading. He nearly laughed at the thought. No point, of course. She could know nothing. Patience, he could be done with her, and her never-changing eyes. The tower held things worth a little patience in its strong rooms. The Horn of Valir was there, the fabled horn made to call dead heroes back from the grave for the last
lemon
battle.
pound cake crumble.
Even most of the Aes Sedai were ignorant of
And I
that,
still got some
but he knew how to sniff out things.
of the ice cream cake
The dagger was there.
sugar wax too.
He felt its pull where he stood. He could have pointed to it. It was his, a part of him, stolen and mired away here by these Aes Sedai. Having the dagger would make up for so much lost. He was not sure how, but he was sure it would. For Aridhol lost. Too dangerous to return to Aridhol. Perchance to be trapped there again. He shivered. So long trapped. Not again. Of course, no one called it Aridhol any longer, but Shadar Logoth, where the shadow waits. An apt name. So much had changed. Even himself. Padan Fane. Mordeth. Or Deeth. Sometimes he was uncertain which name was really his, who he really was. One thing was sure, he was not what anyone thought. Those who believed they knew him were badly mistaken. He was transfigured now, a force unto himself and beyond any other power. They would all learn, eventually. Suddenly he realized with a start that the Amerlin had said something. Casting about in his mind, he found it. "Yes, Mother. The coat suits me very well." He ran a hand down the black velvet to show how fine he found it, as if garments mattered. "'Tis a very good coat. I am thanking you kindly, Mother." He was prepared to suffer more of her trying to make him feel at ease, ready to kneel and kiss her ring. But this time she went straight to the heart. "Tell me more of what you know of Randall, Master Fane." Fane's eyes went to the painting of the two men, and as he gazed at it, his back straightened. Althor's portrait touched him almost as much as the man would, sent rage and hate roiling along his veins. Because of that young man, he had suffered pain beyond remembering. Pain he did not let himself remember. Suffered far worse than pain. He had been broken and remade because of Althor. Of course, that remaking gave him the means of revenge, but that was beside the point. Beside his desire for Althor's destruction, everything else dimmed from sight. When he turned back to the Amerlin, he did not realize his manner was as commanding as hers, meeting her stare to stare. "Rand Althor is devious and sly, uncaring of anyone or anything but his own power. Fool woman. He's never a one to do what you expect. But if she could put Althor in his hands. He is difficult to lead, very difficult. But I believe it can be done. First, you must tie a string to one of the few he trusts. If she gave him Althor, he might leave her alive when he finally went, even if she was Aes Sedai." Lounging in a gilded chair in his shirt sleeves, one booted leg over the padded arm, Ravine smiled as the woman standing before the fireplace repeated what he had told her. There was a slight glaze in her large brown eyes. A young, pretty woman, even in the plain gray woolens she had adopted for disguise, but that was not what interested him about her. No breath of air stirred through the room's tall windows. Sweat rolled down the woman's face as she spoke, and beaded on the narrow face of the other man present. For all of that man's fine red silk coat with its golden embroidery, he stood as stiffly as a servant, which he was, in a way, if of his own free will, unlike the woman. Of course, he was deaf and blind for the moment. Ravine handled the flows of spirit he had woven around the pair delicately. There was no need to damage valuable servants. He did not sweat, of course. He did not let the summer's lingering heat touch him. He was a tall man, large, dark, and handsome, despite the white streaking his temples. Compulsion was no difficulty. A scowl twisted his face. It did with some. A few, a very few, had a strength of self so firm that their minds searched, even if unaware, for crevices through which to slide away. It was his bad luck that he still had some small need for one such. She could be handled, but she kept trying to find escape without knowing she was trapped. Eventually that one would no longer be needed, of course. He would have to decide whether to send her on her way, or be rid of her more permanently. Dangers lay either way. Nothing that could threaten him, of course, but he was a careful man, meticulous. Small dangers had a way of growing if ignored, and he always chose his risks with a measure of prudence. To kill her or keep her? The cessation of the woman's speech pulled him from his reverie. "When you leave here," he told her, "you will remember nothing of this visit. You will remember only taking your usual morning walk." She nodded, eager to please him, and he tied off the strands of spirit lightly, so they would evaporate from her mind shortly after she reached the street. Repeated use of compulsion made obedience easier, even when it was not in use, but while it was, there was always a danger it might be detected. That done, he released Elegar's mind as well. Lord Elegar. A minor noble, but faithful to his vows. He licked his thin lips nervously and glanced at the woman, then went immediately to one knee before Ravine. Friends of the Dark Friends they were called now, had begun learning just how strictly they would be kept to their vows, now that Ravine and the others were freed. Take her to the street by back ways, Ravine said, and leave her there. She is not to be seen. It will be as you say, Great Master, Elegar said, bowing where he knelt. Rising, he backed from Ravine's presence, bowing and pulling the woman along by one arm. She went docilely, of course, her eyes still fogged. Elegar would ask her no questions. He knew enough to be well aware that there were things he did not want to know. One of your play pretties, a woman's voice said behind him as the carved door closed. Have you taken them to dressing them like that? Snatching its iodine, he filled himself with the power, the taint of the male half of the true source, rolling off the protection of his bonds and oaths, the ties to what he knew as a greater power than the light or even the Creator. In the middle of the chamber, a gateway stood above the red and gold carpet, an opening to somewhere else. He had a brief view of a chamber lined with snowy silken hangings before it vanished, leaving a woman clad in white and belted in woven silver. The slight tingle in his skin, like a faint chill, was all that told him she had channeled. Tall and slender, she was as beautiful as he was handsome, her dark eyes bottomless pools, her hair decorated with silver stars and crescents falling in perfect black waves to her shoulders. Most men would have felt their mouths go dry with desire. What do you mean to come sneaking up on me, Lanfear? He demanded roughly. He did not let go of the power, but rather prepared several nasty surprises in case he had need. If you want to speak with me, send an emissary, and I will decide when and where. And if. Lanfear smiled that sweet, treacherous smile. You were always a pig, Ravine, but seldom a fool. That woman is Aes Sedai. What if they miss her? Do you also send out heralds to announce where you are? Channel, he sneered. She is not strong enough to be allowed outdoors without a keeper. They call untutored children Aes Sedai when half what they know is self-taught tricks and the other half barely scratches the surface. Would you still be so complacent if those untutored children put a circle of 13 around you? The cool mockery in her voice stabbed him, but he did not let it show. I take my precautions, Lanfear. Rather than one of my play pretties, as you call them. She is the tower's spy here. Now she reports exactly what I want her to, and she is eager to do so. Those who studied the Chosen in the tower told me right where to find her. The day would come soon when the world gave up the name Forsaken and knelt to the Chosen. It had been promised so very long ago. Why have you come, Lanfear? Surely not in aid of defenseless women. She merely shrugged. You can play with your toys as much as you wish, so far as I am concerned. You offer little in the way of hospitality, Ravine. So you will forgive me if... A silver pitcher rose from a small table by Ravine's bed and tilted to pour dark wine into a gold-chased goblet. As the pitcher settled, the goblet floated to Lanfear's hand. He felt nothing beyond a slight tingle, of course, saw no flows being woven. He had never liked that. That she would be able to see as little of his weaving was only a slight redressing of the balance. Why? He demanded again. She sipped calmly before speaking. Since you avoid the rest of us, a few of the Chosen will be coming here. I came first, so you would know it was not an attack. Others? Some plan of yours? What need have I of someone else's designs? Suddenly he laughed, a deep, rich sound. So it is no attack, is it? You were never one for attacking openly, were you? Not as bad as Mogadeen, perhaps, but you did always favor the flanks and the rear. I will trust you this time, enough to hear you out. as long as you're under my eye. Who trusted Lanfear behind him deserved the knife he might well find in his back. Not that she was so very trustworthy even when watched. Her temper was uncertain at best. Who else is supposed to be part of this? He had clearer warning this time. It was male work. As another gateway opened, showing marble arches open onto wide stone balconies, and gulls wheeling and crying in a cloudless blue sky. Finally a man appeared and stepped through, the way closing behind him. Samael was compact, solid, and larger seeming than he truly was, his stride quick and active, his manner abrupt. Blue-eyed and golden-haired, with a neat, square-trimmed beard, he would perhaps have been above the ordinary in looks, except for a slanting scar, as if a red-hot poker had been dragged across his face from hairline to jaw. He could have had it removed as soon as it was made all those long years ago, but he had elected not to. Linked to Saidin as tightly as Robin, this close Robin could feel it dimly, Samael eyed him warily. I expected serving maids and dancing girls, Robin. Have you finally wearied of your sport after all these years? Lanfear laughed softly into her wine. Did someone mention sport? Robin had not even noticed the opening of a third gateway, showing a large room full of pools and fluted columns, nearly nude acrobats and attendants wearing less. Oddly, a lean old man in a wrinkled coat sat disconsolately among the performers. Two servants in filmy bits of nothing much, a well-muscled man bearing a wrought gold tray, and a beautiful, voluptuous woman anxiously pouring wine from a cut crystal flagon into a matching goblet on the tray, followed the true arrival before the opening winked out. In any other company but Lanfear's, Grendel would have been accounted a stunningly beautiful woman, lush and ripe. Her gown was green silk cut low. A ruby the size of a hen's egg nestled between her breasts, and a coronet encrusted with more rested on her long, sun-colored hair. Beside Lanfear, she was merely plumply pretty. If the inevitable comparison bothered her, her amused smile gave no sign of it. Golden bracelets clattered as she waved a heavily beringed hand generally behind her. The female servant quickly slipped the goblet into her grasp with a fawning smile, mirrored by the man. Grendel took no notice. So, she said gaily, nearly half the surviving chosen in one place, and no one trying to kill anyone. Who would have expected it before the great lord of the dark returns? Ishamael did manage to keep us from one another's throats for a time, but this... Do you always speak so freely in front of your servants? Samael said with a grimace. Grendel blinked, glanced back at the pair as if she had forgotten them. They won't speak out of turn. They worship me. Don't you? The two fell to their knees, practically babbling their fervent love of her. It was real. They actually did love her. Now. After a moment, she frowned slightly and the servants froze, mouths open in mid-word. They do go on. Still, they won't bother you now, will they? Robin shook his head, wondering who they were or had been. Physical beauty was not enough for Grendel's servants. They had to have power or position as well. A former lord for a footman, a lady to draw her bath. That was Grendel's taste. Indulging herself was one thing, but she was wasteful. This pair might have been of use, properly manipulated. But the level of compulsion Grendel employed surely left them good for little more than decoration. The woman had no true finesse. Should I expect more, Lanfear? He growled. Have you convinced Dimondred to stop thinking he is all but the great lord's heir? I doubt he is arrogant enough for that, Lanfear replied smoothly. He can see where it took Ishamael. And that is the point. A point Grendel raised. Once we were 13, immortal. Now 4 are dead. and one has betrayed us. We four are all who meet here today, and enough. Are you certain Asmodean went over? Samael demanded. He never had the courage to take a chance before. Where did he find the heart to join a lost cause? Lanfear's brief smile was amused. He had the courage for an ambush he thought would set him above the rest of us. And when his choice became death or a doomed cause, it took little courage for him to choose. And little time, I'll wager. The scar made Samael's sneer even more biting. If you were close enough to him to know all of this, why did you leave him alive? You could have killed him before he knew you were there. I am not as quick as you to kill. It is final with no going back, and there are usually other, more profitable ways. Besides,
Give me
to
one
put it
second,
in
I want to
terms
be
you would
right
understand,
back.
I did not want to launch a frontal assault against superior forces. Is he really so strong? Ravine asked quietly. This Randall Thor? Could he have overwhelmed you face to face? Not that he himself could not, if it came to it, or Samael, though Grendel would likely link with Lanfear if either of the men tried. For that matter, both women were probably filled to bursting with the power right that moment, ready to strike at the slightest suspicion of either man, or of each other. But this farm boy, an untrained shepherd, untrained unless Asmodean was trying. He is Luz Theron Telamon reborn, Lanfear said just as softly, and Luz Theron was as strong as any. Samael absently rubbed the scar across his face. It had been Luz Theron who gave it to him. 3,000 years ago and more, well before the breaking of the world, before the great lord was imprisoned, before so much, but Samael never forgot. Well, Grendel put in, have we come around at last to what we are here to discuss? Ravin gave a displeased start. The two servants were frozen still, or again, rather. Samael muttered in his beard. If this Randall Thor really is Luz Theron Telamon reborn, Grendel went on, settling herself on the man's back, where he crouched on all fours. I am surprised you haven't tried to snuggle him into your bed, Lanfear. Or would it be so easy? I seem to remember Luz Theron led you by the nose, not the other way around. Squelched your little tantrums, sent you running to fetch his wine, in a manner of speaking. She set her own wine on the tray, held out rigidly by the sightlessly kneeling woman. You were so obsessed with him, you'd have stretched out at his feet if he said rug. Lanfear's dark eyes glittered for a moment before she regained control of herself. He may be Luz Theron reborn, but he is not Luz Theron himself. How do you know? Grendel asked, smiling as if it were all a joke. It may well be that, as many believe, all are born and reborn as the wheel turns. But nothing like this has ever happened that I have read. A specific man reborn according to prophecy. Who knows what he is? Lanfear gave a disparaging smirk. I've observed him closely. He is no more than the shepherd he seems, still more naive than not. Scorn faded to seriousness. But now he has Asmodean, weak ally as he is. And even before Asmodean, 4 of the Chosen have died confronting him. Let him whittle away the dead wood, Samael said gruffly. He wove flows of air to drag a chair across the carpet, and sprawled with his boots crossed at the ankle and one arm over the low carved back. Anyone who believed he was at ease was a fool. Samael had always liked to dupe his enemies into thinking they could take him by surprise. More for the rest of us on the day of return. Or do you think he might win Tarmangaeon, Lanfear? Even if he stiffens Asmodean's backbone, he has no 100 companions this time. With Asmodean or alone, the Great Lord will extinguish him like a broken starlight. The look Lanfear gave him bristled with contempt. How many of us will be alive when the Great Lord is freed at last? 4 gone already. Will he come after you next, Samael? You might like that. You could finally get rid of that scar if you defeated him. But I forget. How many times did you face him in the War of Power? Did you ever win? I cannot seem to remember. Without pause, she rounded on Grendel. Or it might be you. He is reluctant to hurt women for some reason, but you won't even be able to make Asmodean's choice. You cannot teach him any more than a stone could. Unless he decides to keep you as a pet. That would be a change for you, would it not? Instead of deciding which of your pretties pleases you best, you could learn to please. Grendel's face contorted, and Robin prepared to shield himself against whatever the 2 women might hurl at one another, prepared to travel at even a whiff of balefire. Then he sensed Samael gathering the power, sensed a difference in it. Samael would call it seizing a tactical advantage, and bent to grab the other man's arm. Samael shook him off angrily, but the moment had passed. The 2 women were looking at them now, not each other. Neither could know what had almost happened, but clearly something had passed between Robin and Samael, and suspicion lit their eyes. I want to hear what Lanfear has to say. He did not look at Samael, but meant it for him. There must be more to this than a foolish attempt to frighten us. Samael jerked his head in what might have been a nod or merely disgruntlement. It would have to do. Oh, there is, though a little fright could not hurt. Lanfear's dark eyes still held distrust, but her voice was as clear as still water. Ishamael tried to control him and failed. Tried to kill him in the end and failed. But Ishamael tried bullying and fear. And bullying does not work with Randall Thor. Ishamael was more than half mad, Samael muttered, and less than half human. Is that what we are? Grendel arched an eyebrow. Merely human. Surely we are something more. This is human. She stroked a finger down the cheek of the woman kneeling beside her. A new word will have to be created to describe us. Whatever we are, Lanfear said, we can succeed where Ishamael failed. She was leaning slightly forward as if to force the words on them. Lanfear seldom showed tension. Why now? Why only we 4? Robin asked. The other why would have to wait. Why more? Was Lanfear's reply. If we can present the Dragon Reborn kneeling to the Great Lord on the Day of Return, why share the honor and the rewards further than need be? And perhaps he can even be used to, how did you put it, Samael? Whittle away the dead wood. It was the sort of answer Ravine could understand. Not that he trusted her, of course, or any of the others, but he understood ambition. The Chosen had plotted among themselves for position up to the day Lews Therin had imprisoned them in sealing up the Great Lord's prison. And they had begun again the day they were freed. He just had to be sure Lanfear's plot did not disrupt his own plans. Speak on, he told her. First, someone else is trying to control him, perhaps to kill. I suspect Moghedien or Dimandred. Moghedien has always tried to work from the shadows, and Dimandred always did hate Lews Therin. Samael smiled, or perhaps grimaced, but his hatred was a pale thing beside Dimandred's, though for better cause. How do you know it is not one of us here? Grendel asked glibly. Lanfear's smile showed as many teeth as the other woman's, and as little warmth. Because you 3 choose to carve out niches for yourselves and secure your power, while the rest slash at each other. And other reasons. I told you I keep a close watch on Randall Thor. It was true what she said of them. Ravin himself preferred diplomacy and manipulation to open conflict, though he would not shy from it if needed. Samael's way had always been armies and conquest. He would not go near Lews Therin, even reborn as a shepherd, until he was sure of victory. Grendel, too, followed conquest, though her methods did not involve soldiers. For all her concern with her toys, she took one solid step at a time. Openly, to be sure, as the Chosen reckon such things, but never stretching too far at any step. You know I can keep an eye on him unseen, Lanfear continued, but the rest of you must stay clear or run the risk of detection. We must draw him back. Grendel leaned forward, interested, and Samael began to nod as she went on. Ravin reserved judgment. It might well work. And if not, he saw several ways to shape events to his advantage. This might work out very well indeed.
Chapter 1. Fanning the Sparks. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the great forest called Brame Wood. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. South and west it blew, dry, beneath a sun of molten gold. There had been no rain for long weeks in the land below, and the late summer heat grew day by day. Brown leaves come early, dotted some trees, and naked stones baked where small streams had run. In an open place where grass had vanished and only thin, withered brush held the soil with its roots, the wind began uncovering long-buried stones. They were weathered and worn, and no human eye would have recognized them for the remains of a city remembered in story, yet otherwise forgotten. Scattered villages appeared before the wind crossed the border of Andor, and fields where worried farmers trudged arid furrows. The forest had long since thinned to thickets by the time the wind swept dust down the lone street of a village called Core Springs. The springs were beginning to run low this summer. A few dogs lay panting in the swelter, and two shirtless boys ran, beating a stuffed bladder along the ground with sticks. Nothing else stirred, save the wind and the dust and the creaking sign above the door of the inn, red brick and thatch roofed like every other building along the street. At 2 stories, it was the tallest and largest structure in Core Springs, a neat and orderly little town. The saddled horses hitched in front of the inn barely twitched their tails. The inn's carved sign proclaimed, "The Good Queen's Justice." Blinking against the dust, Min kept an eye pressed to the crack in the shed's rough wall. She could just make out one shoulder of the guard on the shed door, but her attention was all for the inn further on. She wished the name were less ominously apt. Their judge, the local lord, had apparently arrived some time ago, but she had missed seeing him. No doubt he was hearing the farmers' charges. Admer Nem, along with his brothers and cousins and all their wives, had seemed in favor of an immediate hanging before one of the lord's retainers happened by. She wondered what the penalty was here for burning up a man's barn, and his milk cows with it. By accident, of course, but she did not think that would count for much when it all began with trespass. Loghain had gotten away in the confusion, abandoning them. He would burn him, and she did not know whether to be happy about that or not. It was he who had knocked Nem down when they were discovered just before dawn, sending the man's lantern flying into the straw. The blame was his, if anyone's. Only sometimes he had trouble watching what he said. Perhaps as well he was gone. Twisting to lean back against the wall, she wiped sweat from her brow, though it only sprang out again. The inside of the shed was stifling, but her 2 companions did not appear to notice. Swan lay stretched out on her back in a dark woolen riding dress much like Min's, staring at the shed roof, idly tapping her chin with a straw. Coppery-skinned Liana, willowy and as tall as most men, sat cross-legged in her pale shift, working on her dress with needle and thread. They had been allowed to keep their saddlebags, after they were searched for swords or axes or anything else that might help them escape. "What's the penalty for burning down a barn in Andor?" Min asked. "If we are lucky," Swan replied without moving. "A strapping in the village square. Not so lucky, and it will be a flogging." "Light," Min breathed. "How can you call that luck?" Swan rolled onto her side and propped herself up on an elbow. She was a sturdy woman, short of beautiful, though beyond handsome, and looked no more than a few years older than Min. But those sharp eyes had a commanding presence that did not belong on a young woman awaiting trial in a back-country shed. Sometimes Swan was as bad as Logain about forgetting herself, maybe worse. "When a strapping is done," she said in a brook no-nonsense, do-not-be-foolish tone, "it is done, and we can be on our way. It wastes less of our time than any other penalty I can think of. Considerably less than hangings, say. Though I don't think it will come to that, from what I remember of Andoran law." Wheezing laughter shook Min for a moment. It was that or cry. "Time? The way we're going, we've nothing but time. I swear we have been through every village between here and Tar Valon and found nothing. Not a glimmer, not a whisper. I don't think there is any gathering, and we are on foot now. From what I overheard, Logain took the horses with him. Afoot and locked in a shed, awaiting the light knows what." "Watch names," Swan whispered sharply, shooting a meaning glance at the rough door with the guard on the other side. "A flapping tongue can put you in the net instead of the fish." Min grimaced, partly because she was growing tired of Swan's tyrant fisherman's sayings, and partly because the other woman was right. So far they had outrun awkward news. Deadly was a better word than awkward. But some news had a way of leaping 100 miles in a day. Swan had been traveling as Mara, Lyanna as Amena, and Logain had taken the name Dalin after Swan convinced him Gwair was a fool's choice. Min still did not think anyone would recognize her own name, but Swan insisted on calling her Serenla. Even Logain did not know their true names. The real trouble was that Swan was not going to give up. Weeks of utter failure, and now this, yet any mention of heading for Tyr, which was sensible, set off a tempest that quailed even Logain. The longer they had searched without finding what Swan sought, the more temper she had developed. Not that she couldn't crack rocks with it before. Min was wise enough to keep that particular thought to herself. Lyanna finally finished with her dress and tugged it on over her head, doubling her arms behind her to do up the buttons. Min could not see why she had gone to the trouble. She herself hated needlework of any sort. The neckline was a little lower now, showing a bit of Lyanna's bosom, and it fit in a snugger way there and perhaps around the hips. But what was the point here? No one was going to ask her to dance in this roasting shed. Digging into Min's saddlebags, Lyanna pulled out the wooden box of paints and powders and whatnots that Laras had forced on Min before they set out. Min had kept meaning to throw it away, but somehow she had never gotten around to it. There was a small mirror inside the hinged lid of the box, and in moments Lyanna was at work on her face with small rabbit fur brushes. She had never shown any particular interest in the things before. Now she appeared vexed that there was only a blackwood hairbrush and a small ivory comb to use on her hair. She even muttered about the lack of a way to heat the curling iron. Her dark hair had grown since they began Swan's search, but it still came well short of her shoulders. After watching a bit, Min asked, "What are you up to, Amena?" She stopped looking at Swan. She could guard her tongue. It was just being cooped up and baked alive. That on top of the coming trial. A hanging or a public strapping. What a choice. "Have you decided to take up flirting?" It was meant for a joke. Lyanna was all business and efficiency, something to enlighten the moment. But the other woman surprised her. "Yes," Lyanna said briskly, peering wide-eyed into the mirror while she carefully did something to her eyelashes. "And if I flirt with the right man, perhaps we will not need to worry about strappings or anything else. At the least, I might get us lighter sentences." Hand half raised to wipe her face again, Min gasped. It was like an owl announcing it meant to become a hummingbird. But Swan merely sat up, facing Liana, with a level, "What brought this on?" Had Swan directed that gaze at her, Min suspected she would have confessed to things she had forgotten. When Swan concentrated on you like that, you found yourself curtsying and leaping to do as you were told before you realized it. Even Logain did, most of the time, except for the curtsy. Liana calmly stroked a tiny brush along her cheekbones and examined the result in the small mirror. She did glance at Swan, but whatever she saw, she answered in the same crisp tones she always used. "My mother was a merchant, you know, in furs and timber mainly. I once saw her fog a Saldaean lord's mind, till he consigned his entire year's timber harvest to her for half the amount he wanted, and I doubt he realized what had happened until he was nearly back home, if then. He sent her a moonstone bracelet later. Domani women don't deserve the whole reputation they have. Stiff-necked prigs, going by hearsay, built most of it. But we have earned some. My mother and my aunts taught me, along with my sisters and cousins, of course." Looking down at herself, she shook her head, then returned to her ministration with a sigh. "But I fear I was as tall as I am today on my 14th naming day, all knees and elbows like a colt that grew too fast. And not long after I could walk across a room without tripping twice, I learned—" She drew a deep breath. "Learned my life would take me another way than being a merchant. And now that is gone, too. About time I put to use what I was taught all those years ago. Under the circumstances, I can't think of a better time or place." Swan studied her shrewdly a moment more. "That isn't the reason. Not the whole reason. Out with it." Hurling a small brush into the box, Liana blazed up in a fury. "The whole reason? I do not know the whole reason. I only know I need something in my life to replace what is gone. You yourself told me that is the only hope of surviving. Revenge falls short for me. I know your cause is necessary and perhaps even right, but the light helped me that is not enough either. I can't make myself be as involved as you. Maybe I came too late to it. I will stay with you, but it isn't enough." Anger faded as she began resealing pots and vials and replacing them, though she used more force than was strictly necessary. There was the merest hint of rose scent about her. "I know flirting isn't something to fill up the emptiness, but it is enough to fill an idle moment. Maybe being who I was born to be will suffice. I just do not know. This isn't a new idea. I always wanted to be like my mother and my aunts, daydreamed of it sometimes after I was grown." Liana's face became pensive, and the last things went into the box more gently. "I think perhaps I've always felt I was masquerading as someone else, building up a mask until it became second nature. There was serious work to be done, more serious than merchanting, and by the time I realized there was another way I could have gone, even so, I had the mask on too firmly to take off. Well, that is done with now, and the mask is coming off. I even considered beginning with Logain a week ago for practice, but I am out of practice, and I think he is the kind of man who might hear more promises than you meant to offer, and expect to have them fulfilled." A small smile suddenly appeared on her lips. "My mother always said, if that happened, you had miscalculated badly. If there was no back way out, you had to either abandon dignity and run, or pay the price and consider it a lesson." The smile took on a roguish cast. "My Aunt Rasara said you paid the price and enjoyed it." Min could only shake her head. It was as if Liana had become a different woman, talking that way about... Even hearing it, she could hardly believe. Come to that, Liana actually looked different. For all of the work with brushes, there was not a hint of paint or powder on her face that Min could see, yet her lips seemed fuller, her cheekbones higher, her eyes larger. She was a more than pretty woman at any time, but now her beauty was magnified fivefold. Swan was not quite finished, though. "And if this country lord is one like Logain," she said softly, "what will you do then?" Liana drew herself up, stiff-backed on her knees, and swallowed hard before answering, but her voice was perfectly level. given the alternatives. What choice would you make? Neither blinked, and the silence stretched. Before Swan could answer it, if she meant to, Min would have given a pretty to hear it. The chain and lock rattled on the other side of the door. The other two women got slowly to their feet, gathering their saddlebags in calm preparation, but Min leaped up, wishing she had her belt knife. Fool thing to wish for, she thought. Just get me in worse trouble. I'm no bloody hero in a story. Even if I jumped the guard. The door opened, and a man with a long leather jerkin over his shirt filled the doorway. Not a fellow to be attacked by a young woman, even with a knife. Maybe not even with an axe. Wide was the word for him, and thick. The few hairs remaining on his head were more white than not, but he looked hard as an old oak stump. "Time for you girls to stand before the Lord," he said gruffly. "Will you walk, or must we haul you like grain sacks? You go either way, but I'd as soon not have to carry you in this heat." Peeking past him, Min saw two more men waiting, gray-haired but just as hard, if not quite so big. "We will walk," Swan told him dryly. "Good. Come then. Step along. Lord Gareth won't like being kept waiting." Promise to walk or no, each man took one of them firmly by the arm as they started up the dusty dirt street. The balding man's hand encircled Min's arm like a manacle. So much for running for it, she thought bitterly. She considered kicking his booted ankle to see if that would loosen his grip, but he looked so solid she suspected all it would earn her was a sore toe and being dragged the rest of the way. Liana appeared lost in thought. She half made small gestures with her free hand, and her lips moved silently as though reviewing what she meant to say, but she kept shaking her head and starting over again. Introspection wrapped Swan too, but she wore an openly worried frown, even chewing her underlip. Swan never showed that much unease. All in all, the pair of them did nothing for Min's confidence. The beam-ceilinged common room of the good Queen's Justice did less. Lank-haired Admiral Nem, a yellowed bruise around his swollen eye, stood to one side, with half a dozen equally stout brothers and cousins and their wives, all in their best coats or aprons. The farmers eyed the three prisoners with a mixture of anger and satisfaction that made Min's stomach sink. If anything, the farm wives' glares were worse, pure hate. The rest of the walls were lined 6 deep with villagers, all garbed for the work they had interrupted for this. The blacksmith still wore his leather apron, and a number of women had sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with flour. The room buzzed with their murmuring among themselves, the elders as much as the few children, and their eyes latched onto the 3 women as avidly as the Nems did. Min thought this must be as much excitement as Core Springs had ever witnessed. She had seen a crowd with this mood once, at an execution. The tables had been removed, except for one placed in front of the long brick fireplace. A bluff-faced, stocky man, his hair thick with gray, sat facing them in a well-cut coat of dark green silk, hands folded in front of him on the tabletop. A slim woman who showed as much age stood beside the table in a fine gray wool dress, embroidered with white flowers around the neck. The local lord, Min supposed, and his lady. Country nobility, little better informed of the world than their tenants and crofters. The guards situated them in front of the lord's table and melted into the watchers. The woman in gray stepped forward, and the murmurs died. "All here attend and give ear," the woman announced, "for justice will be meted today by Lord Gareth Bryn. Prisoners, you are called before the judgment of Lord Bryn." Not the lord's lady, then, an official of some sort. Gareth Bryn? The last Min remembered, he was Captain General of the Queen's Guards in Camelin, if it was the same man. She glanced at Swan, but Swan had her eyes locked on the wide floorboards in front of her feet. Whoever he was, this Bryn looked weary. "You are charged," the woman in gray went on, "with trespass by night, arson and destruction of a building and its contents, the killing of valuable livestock, assault on the person of Admiral Nem, and the theft of a purse said to contain gold and silver. It is understood that the assault and theft were the work of your companion who escaped, but you three are equally culpable under the law." She paused to let it sink in, and Min exchanged rueful glances with Liana. Loghain would have to add theft to the stew. He was probably halfway to Mirandi by now, if not more distant yet. After a moment, the woman began again. "Your accusers are here to face you." She gestured to the cluster of Nems. "Admer Nem, you will give your testimony." The stout man eased forward in a blend of self-importance and self-consciousness, tugging at his coat where the wooden buttons strained over his middle, running his hands through thinning hair that kept dropping into his face.
"Like I said, Lord Gareth, it was like this."
He gave a fairly straightforward account of discovering them in the hayloft and ordering them out, though he made Loghain near a foot taller and turned the man's single blow into a fight, where Nem gave as good as he got. The lantern fell, the hay went up, and the rest of the family came spilling out of the farmhouse into the pre-dawn. The prisoners were seized and the barn burned to the ground, and then the loss of the purse from the house was discovered. He did slight the part where Lord Bryn's retainer rode by as some of the family were bringing out ropes and eyeing tree limbs. When he started on the fight again, this time he seemed to be winning. Bryn cut him off. "That will be enough, Master Nem. You may step back." Instead, a round-faced one of the Nem women, of an age to be Admer's wife, joined him. Round-faced but not soft, round like a frying pan or a river rock, and flushed with something more than anger. "You whip these hussies good, Lord Gareth here. Whip them good, and ride them to Jornhill on a rail." "No one called on you to speak, Mygan," the slim woman in gray said sharply. "This is a trial, not a petition meeting. You and Admer step back. Now." They obeyed, Admer with a shade more alacrity than Mygan. The gray-clad woman turned to Min and her companions. "If you wish to offer testimony in defense or mitigation, you may now give it." There was no sympathy in her voice, nor anything else for that matter. Min expected Swan to speak. She always took the lead, did the talking, but Swan never stirred or raised her eyes. Instead, it was Liana who moved toward the table, her eyes on the man behind it. She stood as straight as ever, but her usual walk, a graceful stride, but a stride, had become a sort of glide, with just a hint of willowy sway to it. Somehow her hips and bosom seemed more obvious. Not that she flaunted anything. The way she moved just made you aware. "My lord, we are three helpless women, refugees from the storms that sweep the world." Her usually brisk tones were gone, changed to a velvety soft caress. There was a light in her dark eyes, a sort of smoldering challenge. "Penniless and lost, we took shelter in Master Nem's barn. It was wrong, I know, but we were afraid of the night." A small gesture, hands half raised, the insides of her wrists to Bryn, made her seem for a moment utterly helpless. Only for that moment, though. "The man, Dalin, was a stranger to us, really, a man who offered us his protection. In these days, women alone must have a protector, my lord. Yet I fear we made a poor choice." A widening of the eyes, an entreating look, said he could make a better for them. "It was indeed he who attacked Master Nem, my lord. We would have fled, or worked, to repay our night's lodging." Stepping around the side of the table, she knelt gracefully beside Bryn's chair, and gently rested the fingers of one hand on his wrist as she gazed up into his eyes. A tremble touched her voice, but her slight smile was enough to set any man's heart racing. It suggested, "My lord, we are guilty of some small crime, yet not so much as we are charged with. We throw ourselves on your mercy. I beg you, my lord, have pity on us and protect us." For a long moment Bryn stared back into her eyes. Then, clearing his throat roughly, he scraped back his chair, rose, and walked around the opposite end of the table from her. There was a stir among the villagers and farmers. men clearing their throats as their lord had done, women muttering under their breath. Bryn stopped in front of Min.
What is your name, girl?
Min, my lord. She caught a muffled grunt from Swan and hastily added, Serenla, Min. Everyone calls me Serenla, my lord. Your mother must have had a premonition, he murmured with a smile. He was not the first to react to the name in a like way. Do you have any statement to make, Serenla? Only that I am very sorry, my lord, and it really wasn't our fault. Dalin did it all. I ask for mercy, my lord. That did not seem much alongside Lyanna's plea. Anything at all would seem insignificant beside Lyanna's performance, but it was the best she could find. Her mouth was as dry as the street outside. What if he did decide to hang them? Nodding, he moved over to Swan, who was still studying the floor. Cupping a hand under her chin, he raised her eyes to his. And what is your name, girl? With a jerk of her head, Swan pulled her chin free and took a step back. Mara, my lord, she whispered. Mara Tomanes. Min groaned softly. Swan was plainly frightened, yet at the same time she stared at the man defiantly. Min more than half expected her to demand Bryn to let them walk away on the instant. He asked her if she wished to make a statement, and she denied it in another unsteady whisper, but all the while looking at him as though she were the one in charge.
Give me
She
one
might
second,
be
I'll be
controlling
right
her
back.
tongue, but certainly not her eyes. After a time, Bryn turned away. Take your place with your friends, girl, he told Lyanna as he returned to his chair. She joined them with a look of open frustration, and what in anyone else Min would have called a touch of petulance. I have reached my decision, Bryn said to the room at large. The crimes are serious, and nothing I have heard alters the facts. If 3 men sneak into another's house to steal his candlesticks, and one of them attacks the owner, all 3 are equally guilty. There must be recompense. Master Nem, I will give you the cost of rebuilding your barn, plus the price of 6 milk cows. The stout farmer's eyes brightened until Bryn added, Carolyn will disperse the coin to you when she is content as to costs and prices. Some of your cows were going dry, I hear. The slim woman in gray nodded in satisfaction. For the bump on your head, I award you 1 silver mark. Don't complain, he said firmly as Nem opened his mouth. My gun has given you worse for drinking too much. A ripple of laughter among the onlookers greeted that, not diminished at all by Nem's half-abashed glares, and perhaps spurred by the tight-lipped look Mygan gave her husband. I will also replace the amount of the stolen purse, once Carolyn has satisfied herself as to how much was in it. Nem and his wife appeared equally disgruntled, but they held their tongues. It was plain he had given them what he would. Min began to feel hope. Leaning his elbows on the table, Bryn turned his attention to her and the other 2. His slow words tied her stomach into a knot. You 3 will work for me, at the normal wages for whatever tasks you are given, until the coin I've paid out is repaid to me. Do not think I am being lenient. If you swear an oath that satisfies me you don't have to be guarded, you can work in my manor. If not, it's the fields, where you can be under someone's eyes every minute. Wages are lower in the fields, but it is your decision. Frantically, she racked her brain for the weakest oath that might satisfy. She did not like breaking her word in any circumstances, but she meant to be gone as soon as a chance presented, and she did not want too heavy an oath-breaking on her conscience. Lyanna seemed to be searching too, but Swan barely hesitated before kneeling and folding her hands over her heart. Her eyes seemed fastened to Bryn's, and the challenge had not faded one bit. By the light and my hope of salvation and rebirth, I swear to serve you in whatever way you require for as long as you require, or may the Creator's face turn from me forever and darkness consume my soul. She delivered the words in a breathy whisper, but they created a dead silence. There was no oath stronger, unless it was the one a woman took on being made Aes Sedai, and the oath rod bound her to that as surely as to a part of her flesh. Lyanna stared at Swan, then she was on her knees too. By the light and my hope of salvation and rebirth. Min floundered desperately, searching for some way out. Swearing a lesser oath than they did meant the fields for certain, and someone watching her every instant. But this oath, by what she had been taught, breaking it would be not much less than murder, maybe no less. Only there was no way out. The oath, or who knew how many years laboring in a field all day and probably locked up at night. Sinking down beside the other two women, she muttered the words, but inside she was howling. "Swan, you utter fool! What have you gotten me into now? I can't stay here. I have to go to Rand. Oh, Light, help me." "Well," Bryn breathed, when the last word was spoken, "I did not expect that, but it does suffice. Caroline, would you take Master Nem somewhere and find out what he thinks his losses amount to? And clear everyone else but these three out of here, too, and make arrangements to transport them to the manor. Under the circumstances, I don't think guards will be necessary." The slim woman gave him a harassed look, but in short order she had everyone moving out in a milling throng. Admiral Nem and his male kin stuck close to her, his face especially painted with avarice. The Nem women looked scarcely less greedy, but they still spared a few hard glowers for Min and the other two, who remained kneeling as the room emptied out. For herself, Min did not believe her legs could hold her up. The same phrases repeated over and over in her mind. "Oh, Swan, why? I can't stay here. I can't." "We have had a few refugees through here," Bryn said when the last of the villagers had gone. He leaned back in his chair, studying them. "But never as odd a threesome as you. A Damani." "A Tyran?" Swan nodded curtly. She and Liana stood up, the slender, coppery-skinned woman delicately brushing her knees, Swan simply standing. Men managed to join them on wobbly legs. "And you, Serenla?" Once more he gave the ghost of a smile at the name. "Somewhere in the west of Andor, unless I mistake your accent." "Bearlawn," she muttered, then bit her tongue too late. Someone might know Min was from Bearlawn. "I've heard of nothing in the west to make you refugees," he said in a questioning tone. When she remained silent, he did not press it. "After you have worked off your debt, you will be welcome to remain in my service. Life can be hard for those who've lost their homes, and even a maid's cot is better than sleeping under a bush." "Thank you, my lord," Liana said caressingly, making a curtsy so graceful that even in her rough riding dress it looked part of a dance. Min's echo was leaden, and she did not trust her knees for a curtsy. Swan simply stood there staring at him and said nothing at all. "A pity your companion took your horses. 4 horses would reduce your debt by some." "He was a stranger and a rogue," Liana told him, in a voice suitable for something far more intimate. "I, for one, am more than happy to exchange his protection for yours, my lord." Bryn eyed her, appreciatively, Min thought, but all he said was, "At least you will be safely away from the Nems at the manor." There was no reply for that. Min supposed scrubbing floors in Bryn's manor would not be much different from scrubbing floors in the Nem farmhouse. "How do I get out of this? Light, how?" The silence went on, except for Bryn drumming his fingers on the table. Min would have thought he was at a loss for what to say next, but she did not think this man was ever off balance. More likely he was irritated that only Liana appeared to be showing any gratitude. She supposed their sentence could have been much worse, from his point of view. Perhaps Liana's heated glances and stroking tones had worked after a fashion, but Min found herself wishing the woman had remained the way she was. Being hung up by the wrists in the village square would be better than this. Finally, Caroline returned, muttering to herself. She sounded prickly, reporting to Bryn. "It will take days to get straight answers from those Nems, Lord Gareth. Admer would have 5 new barns and 50 cows if I let him. At least I believe there really was a purse, but as to how much was in it..." She shook her head and sighed. "I will find out eventually. Joni is ready to take these girls to the manor if you are done with them." "Take them away, Caroline," Bryn said, rising.
When you've sent them off, join me at the brickyard."
He sounded weary again.
"Thad Heron says he needs more water if he's to keep making bricks, and the light alone knows where I will find it for him."
He strode out of the common room as if he had forgotten all about the 3 women who had just sworn to serve him. Joni turned out to be the wide, balding man who had come for them in the shed, waiting now in front of the inn beside a high-wheeled cart, enclosed by a round canvas cover, with a lean brown horse in the shafts. A few of the villagers stood about to watch their departure, but most seemed to have gone back to their homes and out of the heat. Gareth Bryn was already far down the dirt street. "Joni will see you safely to the manor," Caroline said. "Do as you are told, and you will not find the life hard." For a moment she considered them, dark eyes nearly as sharp as Swan's. Then she nodded to herself as if satisfied, and hurried off after Bryn. Joni held the curtains open for them at the back of the cart, but let them clamber up unaided and find places to sit on the cart bed. There was not so much as a handful of straw for padding, and the heavy covering trapped the heat. He said not a word. The cart rocked as he climbed up on the driver's seat, hidden by the canvas. Min heard him cluck to the horse, and the cart lurched off, wheels creaking slightly, bumping over occasional potholes. There was just enough of a crack in the covering at the back for Min to watch the village dwindle behind them and vanish, replaced alternately by long thickets and rail-fenced fields. She felt too stunned to speak. Swan's grand cause was to end scrubbing pots and floors. She should never have helped the woman, never stayed with her. She should have ridden for Tyr at the first opportunity. "Well," Liana said suddenly, "that worked out not badly at all." She was back to her usual brisk voice again, but there was a flush of excitement in it, and a high color in her cheeks. "It could have been better, but practice will take care of that." Her low laugh was almost a giggle. "I never realized how much fun it could be, when I actually felt his pulse racing." For a moment she held out her hand the way she had placed it on Bryn's wrist. "I don't think I ever felt so alive, so aware. Aunt Rosara used to say men were better sport than hawks, but I never really understood until today." Holding herself against the sway of the cart, Min goggled at her. "You have gone mad," she said finally. "How many years have we sworn away? 2? 5? I suppose you hope Gareth Bryn will spend them dandling you on his knee. Well, I hope he turns you over it. Every day." The startled look on Liana's face did nothing for Min's temper. Did she expect Min to take it as calmly as she appeared to? But it was not Liana that Min was really angry with. She twisted around to glare at Swan. "And you? When you decide to give up, you don't do it small. You just surrender like a lamb at slaughter. Why did you choose that oath? Light, why?" "Because," Swan replied. "It was the one oath I could be sure would keep him from setting people to watch us night and day, manor house or not." Lying half stretched out on the rough planks of the cart, she made it sound the most obvious thing in the world, and Liana appeared to agree with her. "You mean to break it?" Min said after a moment. It came out in a shocked whisper, but even so she glanced worriedly at the canvas curtains that hid Joni. She did not think he could have heard. "I mean to do what I must," Swan said firmly, but just as softly. "In 2 or 3 days, when I can be sure they really aren't watching us especially, we will leave. I fear we must take horses, since ours are gone. Bryn must have good stables. I will regret that." And Liana just sat there like a cat with cream on her whiskers. She must have realized from the first. That was why she had not hesitated in swearing. "You will regret stealing horses?" Min said hoarsely. "You plan to break an oath anyone but a dark friend would keep, and you regret stealing horses? I can't believe either of you. I don't know either of you." "Do you really mean to stay and scrub pots?" Liana asked, her voice just as low as theirs, "when Rand is out there with your heart in his pocket?" Min glowered silently. She wished they had never learned she was in love with Rand al'Thor. Sometimes she wished she had never learned it. A man who barely knew she was alive, A man like that. What he was no longer seemed as important as the fact that he had never looked at her twice, but it was all of a piece, really. She wanted to say she would keep her oath, forget about Rand for however long it took her to work off her debt. Only she could not open her mouth. Burn him. If I'd never met him, I wouldn't be in this pickle. When the silence between them had gone on far too long for Min's liking, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wheels and the soft thud of the horse's hooves, Swan spoke. I mean to do as I swore to do, when I have finished what I must do first. I did not swear to serve him immediately. I was careful not to even imply it, strictly speaking. A fine point, I know, and one Gareth Bryn might not appreciate, but true all the same. Min sagged in amazement, letting herself lurch with the cart's slow motion. You intend to run away? Then come back in a few years and hand yourselves over to Bryn? The man will sell your hides to a tannery. Our hides. Not until she said that did she realize she had accepted Swan's solution. Run away, then come back and... I can't. I love Rand, and he wouldn't notice if Gareth Bryn made me work in his kitchens the rest of my life. Not a man to cross, I agree, Swan sighed. I met him once, before. I was terrified he might recognize my voice today. Faces may change, but voices don't. She touched her own face wonderingly, as she sometimes did, apparently unaware of doing so. Faces do change, she murmured. Then her tone firmed. I've paid heavy prices already for what I had to do, and I will pay this one, eventually. If you must drown or ride a lionfish, you ride and hope for the best. That is all there is to it, Serenla. Being a servant is far from the future I would choose, Lyanna said, but it is in the future, and who knows what may happen before. I can remember too well when I thought I had no future. A small smile appeared on her lips, her eyes half closed dreamily, and her voice became velvet. Besides, I don't think he will sell our hides at all. Give me a few years of practice, and then a few minutes with Lord Gareth Bryn, and he will greet us with open arms and put us up in his best rooms. He'll deck us with silks, and offer his carriage to carry us wherever we want to go. Min left her wrapped in her fantasy. Sometimes she thought the other two both lived in dream worlds. Something else occurred to her, a small thing, but it was beginning to irritate. Mara, tell me something. I've noticed some people smile when you call me by name. Serenla. Bryn did, and he said something about my mother having a premonition. Why? In the old tongue, Swan replied, it means stubborn daughter. You did have a stubborn streak when we first met, a mile wide and a mile deep. Swan said that. Swan, the most stubborn woman in the whole world. Her smile was as wide as her face. Of course, you do seem to be coming along. At the next village, you might use Chalinda. That means sweet girl. Or maybe... Suddenly the cart gave a harder lurch than any before, then picked up speed as if the horse were reaching for a gallop. Bumping around like grain on a chaffing sieve, the three women stared at one another in surprise. Then Swan levered herself up and pulled aside the canvas, hiding the driver's seat. Joni was gone. Throwing herself across the wooden seat, Swan grabbed the reins and reared back, hauling the horse to a halt. Min threw open the back curtains, searching. The road ran through a thicket here, nearly a small forest of oak and elm, pine and leatherleaf. The dust of their short dash was still settling, some of it on Joni, where he lay sprawled by the side of the hard-packed dirt road, 60 or so paces back. Instinctively, Min leaped down and ran back to kneel beside the big man. He was still breathing, but his eyes were closed, and a bloody gash on the side of his head was coming up in a purple lump. Lyanna pushed her aside and felt Joni's head with sure fingers. He will live, she said crisply. Nothing seems broken, but he will have a headache for days after this. Sitting back on her heels, she folded her hands and her voice saddened. There is nothing I can do for him in any case. I promised myself I would not cry over it again. The question Min swallowed and started again. The question is, do we load him in the back of the cart and take him on to the manor, or do we go? I know better than Swan. We could carry him as far as the next farm, Liana said slowly. Swan came up to them, leading the cart horse as if afraid the placid animal might bite. One glance at the man on the ground, and she frowned. He never had that falling off the cart. I don't see root or rock here to cause it. She started studying the wood around them, and a man rode out of the trees on a tall black stallion, leading 3 mares, one shaggy and 2 hands shorter than the others. He was a tall man in a blue silk coat, with a sword at his side, his hair curling to broad shoulders, darkly handsome, despite a heart as though misfortune had marked him, and he was the last man Min expected to see. "Is this your work?" Swan demanded of him. Logain smiled as he reined in beside the cart, though there was little amusement in it. "A sling is a useful thing, Mara. Now that I am here, I was expected to leave the village for some hours yet, and barely able to walk then. The local lord was indulgent, it seems." Abruptly his face went even darker, and his voice was rough stone. "Did you think I would leave you to your fate? Maybe I should have. You made promises to me, Mara. I want the revenge you promised. I've followed you halfway to the Sea of Storms on this search, though you won't tell me what for. I've asked no questions as to how you plan to give me what you promised, but I will tell you this now. Your time is growing short. End your search soon and deliver your promises, or I will leave you to find your own way. We find most people small sympathy to penniless strangers. 3 pretty women alone. The sight of this," he touched the sword at his hip, "has kept you safe more times than you can know. Find what you are seeking soon, Mara." He had not been so arrogant at the beginning of their journey. Then he had been humbly thankful for their help, as humbly as a man like Logain could manage, anyway. It seemed that time, and a lack of results, had withered his gratitude. Swan did not flinch away from his stare. "I hope to," she said firmly. "But if you want to go, then leave our horses and go. If you won't row, get out of the boat and swim by yourself. See how far you get with your revenge alone." Logain's big hands tightened on his reins until Min heard his knuckles crack. He shivered with emotions in strong check. "I will stay a while longer, Mara," he said finally. "A little while longer." For an instant, to Min's eyes, a halo flared around his head, a radiant crown of gold and blue. Swan and Liana saw nothing, of course, though they knew what she could do. Sometimes she saw things about people, viewings she called them, images or auras. Sometimes she knew what they meant. That woman would marry. That man would die. Small matters or grand events, joyous or bleak. There was never any rhyme or reason to who or where or when. Aes Sedai and warders always had auras. Most people never did. It was not always pleasant, knowing. She had seen Logain's halo before, and she knew what it meant. Glory to come. But for him, perhaps above all men, surely that made no sense at all. His horse and his sword and his coat had come from playing at dice, though Min was not certain how fair the games had been. He had nothing else, and no profit except Swan's promises, and how could Swan ever keep them? His very name was likely a death sentence. It just made no sense. Logain's humor returned as suddenly as it had gone. Pulling a fat, roughly woven purse from his belt, he jangled it at them. "I've come by a few coins. We won't have to sleep in another barn for a while." "We heard of it," Swan said dryly. "I suppose I should have expected no better from you. Think of it as a contribution to your search." She stretched out her hand, but he tied the purse back to his belt with a faintly mocking grin. "I would not want to taint your hand with stolen coin, Mara. Besides, this way, perhaps I can be sure you won't run off and leave me." Swan looked as if she could have bitten a nail in two, but she said nothing. Standing in his stirrups, Logain peered down the road toward Core Springs. I see a flock of sheep coming this way and a pair of boys. Time for us to ride. They'll carry word of this as fast as they can run. Settling back down, he glanced at Joni, still lying there unconscious. And they'll fetch help for that fellow. I don't think I hit him hard enough to hurt him badly. Min shook her head. The man continually surprised her. She would not have thought he would spare a second thought for a man whose head he had just cracked. Swan and Liana wasted no time scrambling into their high-cantled saddles, Liana onto the gray mare she called Moonflower, Swan onto Bella, the short, shaggy mare. It was more of a scramble for Swan. She was no horsewoman. After weeks in the saddle, she still treated sedate Bella like a fiery-eyed warhorse. Liana handled Moonflower with effortless ease. Men knew she was somewhere in between. She climbed onto Wild Rose, her bay, with considerably more grace than Swan, considerably less than Liana. "Do you think he will come after us?" Min asked as they started south, away from Core Springs, at a trot. She meant the question for Swan, but it was Logain who answered. "The local lord? I doubt he thinks you important enough. Of course he may send a man, and he'll certainly spread your descriptions. We will ride as far as we can manage before stopping, and again tomorrow." It seemed he was taking charge. "We aren't important enough," Swan said, bouncing awkwardly in her saddle. She might have been wary of Bella, but the look she directed at Logain's back said his challenge to her authority would not last long. For herself, Min hoped Bryn considered them unimportant. He probably did, as long as he never learned their real names. Logain quickened the stallion's pace, and she heeled Wild Rose to keep up, putting her thoughts ahead, not behind.
Tucking his leather gauntlets behind his sword belt, Gareth Bryn picked up the curl-brimmed velvet hat from his writing table. The hat was the latest fashion from Camelin. Carlin had seen to that. He had no care for fashion, but she thought he should dress suitably for his position, and it was the silks and velvets she laid out for him in the mornings. As he set the high-crowned hat on his head, he caught sight of his shadowy reflection in one of the study windows. Fitting that it was so wavery and thin. Squint as much as he would, his gray hat and gray silk coat, embroidered with silver scrolls down the sleeves and collar, looked nothing like the helmet and armor he was used to. That was over and done. And this was something to fill empty hours, that was all. "Are you certain you want to do this, Lord Gareth?" He turned from the window to where Carlin stood beside her own writing table, across the room from his. Hers was piled with the estate account books. She had run his estates all the years he had been gone, and without doubt she still made a better job of it than he did. "If you had set them to work for Admir Nem, as the law required," she went on, "this would be none of your affair at all." "But I did not," he told her, "and would not if I had it to do again. You know as well as I do, Nem and his male kin would be trying to corner those girls day and night. And my girl, and the rest of the women, would make their lives the pit of doom. That is, if all three girls didn't accidentally fall down a well and drown." "Even my gun would not so well," Carlin said dryly, "not with the weather we've been having. Still, I take your point. But you also have next of a day and a night to run an engine. You will locate them by sending out word of them, if they can be found." "Thad can find them." Thad was over 70, but he could still track yesterday's stone by moonlight, and he had been more than happy to turn the brickyard over to his son. "If you say so, Lord Gareth." Thad might get on. "Well, when you bring them back, I will certainly use them in the house." Something in her voice, casual as it was, pricked his attention. A touch of satisfaction. Practically from the day he arrived home, Carlin had introduced a succession of pretty maids and farm girls into the manor house, all willing and eager to help the lord forget his miseries. They are oath breakers, Carlin. I fear it's the field for them. A brief, exasperated tightening of her lips confirmed his suspicions, but she kept her tone indifferent. The other two, perhaps, Lord Gareth, but the domestic race would be wasted in the field, and would suit serving at table very well. A remarkably pretty young woman. Still, it will be as you wish, of course. So that was the one Carlin had picked out. A remarkably pretty young woman indeed, though oddly different from the Domani women he had met. A touch hesitant here, a touch too fast there. Almost as if she were just now trying out her arts for the first time. That was impossible, of course. Domani women trained their daughters to twine men around their fingers almost from the cradle. Not that she had been ineffective. If Carlin had sprung her on him among the farm girls, remarkably pretty. So why was it not her face that kept filling his mind? Why did he find himself thinking of a pair of blue eyes, challenging him as though wishing she had a sword, afraid and refusing to yield to fear? Mara Tomanis. He had been sure she was one to keep her word, even without oaths. I will bring her back, he muttered to himself. I will know why she broke oath. As you say, my lord, Carlin said. I thought she might do for your bedchamber maid. Selah is getting a bit old to be running up and down the stairs to fetch for you at night. Bryn blinked at her. What? Oh, the Domani girl. He shook his head at Carlin's foolishness. But was he being any less foolish? He was the lord here. He should remain here to take care of his people. Yet Carlin had taken better care than he knew how, all the years he was gone. He knew camps and soldiers and campaigns, and maybe a bit of how to maneuver in court intrigues. She was right. He should take off his sword and this fool hat, and have Carlin write out their descriptions, and... Instead, he said, keep a close eye on Admiral Nem and his kin. They'll try to cheat you as much as they can. As you say. The words were perfectly respectful. The tone told him to go teach his grandfather to shear sheep. Chuckling to himself, he went outside. The manor house was really little more than a tremendously overgrown farmhouse. 2 rambling stories of brick and stone under a slate roof, added to again and again by generations of Bryns. House Bryn had owned this land, or it had owned them, since Andor was wrought from the wreckage of Arthur Hawkwing's empire 1,000 years before. And for all that time, it had sent its sons off to fight Andor's wars. He would fight no more wars, but it was too late for House Bryn. There had been too many years, too many battles. He was the last of the blood. No wife, no son, no daughter. The line ended with him. All things had to end. The wheel of time turned. 20 men waited beside saddled horses on the stone-paved yard in front of the manor house. Men even grayer than he, mostly, if they had hair. Experienced soldiers all, former squadmen, squadron leaders, and bannermen who had served with him at one time or another in his career. Johnny Chagrin, who had been senior bannerman of the Guards, was right at the front with a bandage around his temples, though Bryn knew for a fact his daughters had set their children to keep him in his bed. He was one of the few who had any family, here or anywhere else. Most had chosen to come serve Gareth Bryn again, rather than drink away their pensions over reminiscences no one but another old soldier wanted to hear. All wore swords belted over their coats, and a few carried long steel-tipped lances that hung for years on a wall until this very morning. Every saddle had a fat blanket roll behind and bulging saddlebags, plus a pot or kettle and full water bags, just as if they were riding out on campaign instead of a week's jaunt to chase down 3 women who set fire to a barn. Here was a chance to relive old days, or pretend to. He wondered if that was what was rousting him out. He was certainly too old to go riding off after a set of pretty eyes and a woman young enough to be his daughter, maybe his granddaughter. I am not that big a fool, he told himself firmly. Carlin could manage things better with him not getting in the way. A lanky bay gelding came galloping up the oak lane that led down to the road, and the rider threw himself out of the saddle before the animal came to a full stop. The man half stumbled, but still managed to put fist to heart in a proper salute. Barim Halla, who served under him as a senior squadman years ago, was hard and wiry, with a leather egg for a head and white eyebrows.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.